Chapter 1. Stolen Away. James Hook stared at the cracked ceiling of his narrow bedroom, his mind restless despite the stillness of the house. 11 years old, he already felt the weight of expectations pressing on his shoulders. His father's stern voice echoed in his memory. Lectures on discipline, duty, and proper conduct that never seemed to end. His mother, gentler and kind, tried to soften those lessons, but even her warmth couldn't dissolve the ache James carried. He longed for escape, not from his family exactly, but from the smallness of his life. He dreamed of ships and seas, of adventures that stretched beyond the grimy streets of London. Beneath his mattress lay a sketchbook filled with drawings of ships, each one grander than the last, their sails billowing as they carried him far from this place. He imagined himself as their captain, standing tall at the helm, the salty wind whipping through his hair. But dreams were for bedtime, his father often said, and bedtime was for sleep. James sighed and turned on his side, staring at the small, fogged-up window across the room. The moonlight filtered through the panes, casting pale beams onto the worn wooden floor. Outside, the muffled hum of the city seemed distant, like the memory of a sound. Then came the noise. A soft creak, almost imperceptible. James's brow furrowed as he listened, his breath held. It could have been the wind, he thought. The latch on the window was old, prone to shifting in the night. He waited for the sound to fade, but instead, it came again. Louder this time. The latch clicked. James sat up, his heart pounding. The window was open now, the fog swirling into the room like a living thing. At first, he thought it might be a trick of the light, but then he saw it. A figure crouched on the sill. It was a boy. The boy perched on the edge of the window like a bird, his silhouette sharp against the moonlight. His hair was wild and windswept, and his clothes, if they could be called that, were made of green leaves and stitched together scraps. He looked about James's age, but there was something timeless about his face, something both childlike and ancient. "Hello," the boy said. James's fingers tightened around the quilt. He stared at the boy, too stunned to speak. The boy tilted his head, his grin widening. "What's the matter? Don't you know how to say hello?" James swallowed hard. Who are you?" The boy leapt lightly from the windowsill, landing soundlessly on the floor. He moved with a strange grace, like a predator stalking its prey. "I'm Peter," he said. "Peter Pan." James blinked. The name meant nothing to him, but it sounded important, like something out of a story. "What are you doing here?" James asked, his voice trembling. Peter grinned. "I'm here for you." "For me?" Peter nodded, taking a step closer. "You don't belong here, James. Not in this boring little room, with your boring little life." He gestured to the window. "There's a whole world out there, waiting for you. A world where you can be free, where you can do anything you want. Don't you want to see it?" James hesitated. The words were tempting, almost hypnotic, but something about Peter's grin unsettled him. I don't know," he said. "My mother. She'd worry." Peter's expression flickered just for a moment, but then the grin returned, wider than before. "She won't even notice you're gone," he said. "Time works differently where we're going. You'll be back before she even wakes up." "Where are we going?" "To Neverland," Peter said, his eyes gleaming. Peter reached into a small pouch at his side and pulled out a handful of golden dust. It sparkled in the moonlight, swirling in his palm like fireflies. "This," Peter said, is pixie dust. It's what makes flying possible. James stared at the dust, both fascinated and wary. Flying? Peter grinned. All you have to do is think of something happy. James hesitated. Like what? Anything. What makes you smile? James thought of the ships in his sketchbook. The open sea, the wind in his sails, the thrill of adventure. For a moment he could almost feel it, the salt spray on his face, the endless horizon stretching before him. Peter's grin widened. There you go. That's it, now. He tossed the dust into the air, letting it settle over James like a shimmering veil. Just believe. James felt a strange warmth spreading through him, a lightness in his limbs. He looked at Peter, his heart racing. What happens if I fall? You won't, Peter said. I'll catch you. Before James could protest, Peter grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the window. The cold night air rushed into the room, biting at James's skin. Below them, the streets of London stretched out in a maze of flickering gaslights and shadows. Come on, Peter said, his voice brimming with excitement. Trust me. James hesitated, his toes curling against the windowsill. Every instinct told him to pull back, to run, to wake his mother and tell her what had happened. But Peter's grip was firm, his laughter infectious. Just jump, Peter said. James closed his eyes. He thought of the ships, the sea, the wind in his sails. He felt the warmth grow stronger, the lightness more intense. And then he jumped. For a moment he felt nothing but the rush of wind and the pull of gravity. But then, impossibly, he was rising. The air seemed to lift him, carrying him higher and higher until the rooftops of London became a patchwork quilt beneath him. James opened his eyes and gasped. The city stretched out below him, its lights shimmering like stars on the ground. The River Thames wound through the darkness like a silver ribbon, its surface reflecting the pale glow of the moon. Peter soared beside him, laughing. "I told you," he shouted. "You can fly." James laughed, the sound bubbling up from somewhere deep inside him. For the first time in his life, he felt truly free. But as they rose higher, leaving the city behind, a question nagged at the back of James's mind. What had he just agreed to? As they flew, James noticed a flickering light darting around Peter like a firefly. At first, he thought it might be a stray ember from the pixie dust, but then he realized it was something alive. "What's that?" James asked, pointing. Peter glanced at the light and shrugged. "That's Tink. She's a fairy." The light buzzed closer, and James saw that it was indeed a tiny creature, no larger than his palm. Her wings shimmered like glass, and her face, though beautiful, was twisted in a scowl. "She doesn't look very friendly," James said. Peter laughed. "She doesn't like new people. Don't take it personally." Tinkerbell made a rude gesture, her tiny voice chiming like bells. James frowned, but Peter waved him off. "She'll warm up to you. Probably." The night stretched on as they flew, the stars above seeming brighter and closer than James had ever imagined. Time felt strange, the hours slipping by like minutes. Eventually, the city disappeared completely, replaced by an endless expanse of clouds and sky. "Where is Neverland?" James asked. Peter grinned, pointing ahead, just beyond the second star to the right, and straight on till morning. As James followed Peter into the unknown, a mix of exhilaration and unease churned in his chest. The world he had left behind faded into memory, and the promise of Neverland loomed ahead. a place of endless adventure where boys never grew up. But as Peter's laughter echoed in the vast emptiness, James couldn't shake the feeling that he was flying towards something far more complicated than a dream. Chapter 2. Arrival in Neverland. The night sky seemed endless, a canvas of deep indigo pierced by countless stars. James soared through it, the cold wind rushing past his face, his arms spread wide as he followed Peter Pan and the flickering light of Tinker Bell. Below, the city of London had long since disappeared, replaced by a vast stretch of clouds that glowed faintly in the moonlight. "How much farther?" James called, his voice nearly lost to the rushing wind. Peter glanced back, his grin sharp and infectious. "Not far now. Just past the second star to the right and straight on till morning." James squinted, his mind spinning. The second star? He followed Peter's outstretched arm and saw it, a brilliant star burning brighter than the others, its light shimmering like a beacon. As they flew toward it, James felt a strange pull, as though the very fabric of the universe were guiding him forward. Then, all at once, the stars parted, and James gasped. Below him stretched a land that defied description, a place that seemed born of dreams and stories. Neverland. James struggled to take it all in. Rolling green hills gave way to dense jungles teeming with life. Rivers carved silver pathways through golden sands, and waterfalls cascaded from cliffs that seemed to reach the clouds. The sea surrounding the island was a dazzling shade of blue, its surface dotted with smaller islands and hidden coves. And above it all, the skies shimmered with the faint glow of a golden mist. "What do you think?" Peter asked, swooping beside him. James shook his head, his mouth dry. "It's incredible." Peter laughed, the sound bright and full of pride. "I know. Come on. There's so much more to see." As they descended, the details became clearer. The jungle canopy was alive with movement. Birds with shimmering plumage, monkeys swinging through the vines, and creatures James couldn't name darting between the leaves. The waters below sparkled like liquid diamonds. And on one of the smaller islands, James caught sight of figures lounging on rocks. They were women. Or at least they looked like women, until they slipped into the water, their tails flashing in the sunlight. "Mermaids," Peter said, noticing James's stare. "Don't let them fool you. They're not as friendly as they look." James swallowed hard, his excitement tinged with unease. Everything about Neverland was beautiful, but it was a beauty that felt sharp, almost dangerous. Peter led James toward a massive tree that towered above the jungle. Its trunk was wider than any building James had ever seen, its bark gnarled and ancient. The branches stretched out like arms, forming a canopy so dense that it cast the ground below in perpetual twilight. "This is home," Peter said, as he landed gracefully on one of the lower branches. "Come on!" James touched down beside him, his legs trembling slightly as he adjusted to the solid ground. He followed Peter toward the base of the tree, where an enormous hollow yawned open, its entrance glowing with the warm light of lanterns. The air inside was filled with the sounds of laughter and shouting, the occasional clang of metal on metal, and the distant crackle of a fire. "Boys!" Peter called as they stepped into the hollow. "Look who I brought!" The space opened into a sprawling underground cavern, its walls carved with winding tunnels that disappeared into the shadows. The main chamber was alive with activity. Boys of all shapes and sizes darted about, their movements energetic and chaotic. Some were sparring with wooden swords, their laughter mingling with the sharp clack of wood on wood. Others lounged in hammocks strung between the roots, while a group sat around a fire, roasting what looked like oversized mushrooms. At the sight of Peter, the boys erupted into cheers. "A new recruit!" one of them shouted, pointing at James. "What's his name?" another called, grinning. Peter clapped James on the back, nearly knocking him over. "This is James," he announced. "He's from London, a proper gentleman." The boys burst into laughter, their teasing good-natured but relentless. James flushed, but he managed a small smile. Before he could respond, one of the older boys stepped forward. He was taller than the others, his sharp features softened by a welcoming grin. "I'm Nibs," the boy said, holding out a hand. "Welcome to the crew." James shook his hand, surprised by the strength of the grip. "Thanks," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. "Don't worry," Nibs said, his grin widening. "You'll fit in soon enough. We all do." Peter led James to a long wooden table in the center of the cavern, piled high with food, or at least it appeared to be. Roasted meats, steaming pies, fresh fruits, and pastries glistening with sugar filled every inch of the surface. The smells were intoxicating, and James's stomach growled loudly. "Go ahead," Peter said, gesturing to the table. "Dig in." James hesitated, reaching for a slice of pie, but as his fingers brushed against it, the pie seemed to dissolve into mist. He frowned, pulling his hand back. "It's not real," Peter explained, his grin sly. "Not until you believe it is." James frowned. "What do you mean?" "Neverland is all about belief," Peter said. "If you believe something's real, it is. If you don't, it isn't. Simple." The boys cheered in agreement, lifting imaginary cups in mock toasts. James stared at the pie again, his curiosity outweighing his doubt. He thought of the sketches he used to draw, the way he had imagined the sails snapping in the wind, the feel of the rough wood beneath his hands. Slowly, the pie solidified beneath his fingers, its scent growing stronger. He took a cautious bite, and the flavors exploded on his tongue, richer and sweeter than anything he had ever tasted. The boys erupted into cheers, pounding the table and laughing. Peter clapped him on the back. "See? I told you. You've got it in you." The feast continued, the cavern alive with noise and energy. James joined in the laughter, his earlier unease fading into the background. For the first time, he felt like he belonged. That night, James lay in a hammock strung between two thick roots, staring at the cavern ceiling. The glow of the lanterns flickered like distant stars, their light casting dancing shadows on the walls. The warmth of the feast still lingered in his chest, but his mind was restless. Neverland was everything Peter had promised. Beautiful, magical, and free. But there was something about the boys' laughter that felt off. It was too loud, too eager, as though they were laughing because they had to. And the way they glanced at Peter, their eyes flicking toward him for approval, sent a strange chill down James's spine. Peter was magnetic. No doubt about it. He commanded attention effortlessly, his grin sharp and his laughter infectious. But beneath the charm, there was something else, something James couldn't quite name. As he closed his eyes, James tried to push the thoughts away. He was in Neverland now, a place where anything was possible, a place where he didn't have to grow up. And yet, as sleep finally claimed him, the unease lingered, like a shadow just out of reach. Chapter 3. The First Adventure. The first rays of dawn broke over Neverland, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. James stirred in his hammock, the warm light filtering through the tree's thick canopy. The sounds of laughter and footsteps echoed through the cavern, pulling him from sleep. For a moment, he thought he was back in London, but the smell of wood smoke and the faint hum of magic reminded him. He was in Neverland. Peter's voice cut through the noise, bright and commanding. "Boys, get ready! We've got an adventure waiting!" James sat up, his heart quickening. An adventure. The word carried a promise of excitement, of freedom. But as he climbed out of the hammock, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, a flicker of unease crept in. Last night's feast had been enchanting, but the laughter had felt hollow, the camaraderie laced with an unspoken tension. Still, he pushed the doubts aside. This was what he had come for, wasn't it? The lost boys bustled about, strapping on belts and slinging wooden swords over their shoulders. James spotted Nibs near the entrance, sharpening a stick to a point with a small knife. "What's going on?" James asked, joining him. "Adventure Day," Nibs said, grinning. "We're heading into the jungle. Peter's got something planned." James hesitated. "What kind of adventure?" Nibs shrugged. "Could be anything. Sometimes we hunt, sometimes we raid Tiger Lily's tribe. It's always fun." James frowned. "Raid?" Nibs laughed, clapping him on the shoulder. "Don't worry, it's just a game. You'll see." Before James could press further, Peter appeared, his energy electric. He wore a green tunic, a feathered cap perched jauntily on his head, and carried a slender dagger that glinted in the sunlight. Tinker Bell flitted around him, a golden light flickering like a restless flame. "Ready, James?" Peter asked, his grin wide and sharp. James nodded, though his stomach churned with a mix of excitement and unease. "What are we doing?" "You'll see," Peter said, his tone teasing. "Stick with me, and you'll be fine." The boys gathered at the base of the tree, their chatter filling the air. Peter raised a hand, silencing them with a single gesture. "All right, boys, let's show Neverland who's boss." The cheer that followed was deafening, and James found himself swept along with the group as they plunged into the jungle. The jungle was alive with sound. Birds with iridescent feathers called from the treetops, their songs mingling with the rustle of leaves and the distant roar of a waterfall. James struggled to keep up with the others, the dense undergrowth snagging at his clothes. Nibs stayed close, offering the occasional reassuring smile. Peter led the way, his movements quick and confident. He seemed to know every twist and turn of the jungle, every hidden path and shortcut. Tinker Bell darted ahead, her light casting eerie shadows on the trees. "Where are we going?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Peter glanced back, his grin gleaming. "To have some fun." James frowned. Peter's answers always seemed deliberately vague, but the other boys didn't seem to mind. They followed without question, their trust in him absolute. As they pushed deeper into the jungle, the air grew thicker, the light dimmer. The sounds of the boys' laughter faded, replaced by the distant murmur of voices. James's pulse quickened. "What's that?" he asked. Peter's grin widened. "Our guests!" The group emerged into a clearing, where a group of figures stood gathered around a fire. They were tall and imposing, their bodies painted with bright colors and adorned with feathers and beads. Each carried a spear or bow, their movements graceful and deliberate. James recognized them immediately. Tiger Lily's tribe. They think they own this jungle, Peter whispered, his voice dripping with mockery. Let's remind them who's really in charge. James's stomach twisted. What are we going to do? Peter raised a hand, signaling the boys to fan out. Just follow my lead. Before James could argue, Peter leapt into the clearing with a wild whoop. The lost boys followed, their laughter mingling with the sound of rustling leaves and snapping branches. They charged at the tribe, brandishing wooden swords and hurling rocks. The warriors reacted quickly, forming a defensive line and raising their weapons. But their movements were measured, their strikes careful, as though they were holding back. James hesitated at the edge of the clearing, his heart pounding. This didn't feel like a game. "Come on, James," Nibs called, waving him forward. James gripped the wooden sword Peter had given him, his hands trembling. He took a tentative step into the clearing, his mind racing. The scene before him was chaotic, boys and warriors clashing, the air filled with shouts and laughter. But there was no joy in the warriors' faces, only confusion and frustration. Peter darted through the chaos, his movements swift and precise. He mocked the warriors with every step, his laughter sharp and cruel. He grabbed a feathered headdress from one of them, placing it on his head with a flourish. "Nice hat," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Enough!" a voice roared. The clearing fell silent as Tiger Lily stepped forward. She was tall and regal, her painted face fierce and her eyes blazing with anger. She carried a curved blade, its edge glinting in the firelight. Peter grinned, unfazed. "Tiger Lily," he said, his voice dripping with mock sweetness. "Fancy meeting you here?" "You're trespassing," she said coldly. "Take your boys and leave. Now." Peter's grin widened. "Or what?" Tiger Lily raised her blade, but Peter was faster. He darted forward, snatching the weapon from her hand before she could react. The lost boys cheered as Peter twirled the blade, his laughter ringing through the clearing. "See," he said, holding the blade aloft. "You're nothing without me." Tiger Lily's face remained calm, but her eyes burned with fury. "You've made your point, Peter. Now leave." Peter hesitated, his grin faltering for the briefest moment. Then he tossed the blade to the ground and stepped back. "Fine," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "Go. But remember who's in charge." The tribe began to retreat, their movements slow and deliberate. Tiger Lily paused, her gaze locking with James's. For a moment, he thought she might say something, but then she turned and disappeared into the jungle. The lost boys erupted into cheers, lifting Peter onto their shoulders and chanting his name. Peter basked in their adoration, his grin returning as he raised his arms in triumph. James, however, felt sick. The adventure had been nothing like he'd imagined. It wasn't fun. It wasn't exciting. It was cruel. The tribe hadn't been a threat, and yet Peter had humiliated them, all for the sake of proving his dominance. Nibs clapped him on the shoulder. "Pretty great, huh?" he said, grinning. James forced a smile, but he didn't respond. As the boys began the trek back to the hideout, James lingered at the edge of the clearing, his mind racing. "What's wrong?" Peter asked, appearing suddenly at his side. James hesitated. I didn't think it would be like this." Peter's grin tightened. "What did you think it would be?" "I don't know," James admitted. "A game, maybe, but it didn't feel like a game." Peter's expression darkened briefly, but then he laughed, clapping James on the back. "You'll get used to it," he said, his tone light. You're one of us now." That night, as the boys celebrated around the fire, James sat apart, staring into the flames. He replayed the events of the day in his mind, the memory of Tiger Lily's gaze haunting him. She hadn't looked afraid. She had looked angry. And James couldn't shake the feeling that she had every right to be. Peter's laughter rang out, loud and carefree, but to James it sounded sharp. For the first time, he wondered if coming to Neverland had been a mistake. Chapter 4. The Crocodile's Shadow. The warm glow of morning seeped into the Lost Boys' hideout, filtering through the dense canopy of the massive tree. James Hook stirred in his hammock, his dreams fading into a restless unease. The laughter from the previous night's celebration still echoed faintly in his mind. But it felt distant now, like a memory that didn't quite belong to him. He sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes as the sounds of the hideout came alive around him. Boys dashed past, their chatter filled with excitement. From the corner of his eye, he saw Peter Pan perched on a high root, his legs swinging lazily as he observed the morning chaos with a sharp grin. "James!" Peter's voice cut through the noise, bright and commanding. "Get ready! Today's a special day!" James's stomach twisted. "What's happening?" Peter leapt down, landing lightly in front of him. "I'm going to show you something amazing. Something that only the bravest boys get to see." James hesitated, the weight of yesterday's adventure still fresh in his mind. "What is it?" Peter's grin widened. "You'll see." The Lost Boys gathered near the entrance of the hideout, their energy buzzing with curiosity. Peter led the way, Tinker Bell darting around him like a flickering ember. James followed reluctantly, Nibs falling into step beside him. "Do you know where we're going?" James asked. Nibs shrugged. "Crocodile Lagoon, probably. Peter takes us there sometimes." "Crocodile Lagoon?" James repeated, a flicker of alarm in his voice. "Yeah." Nibs smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's exciting." James said nothing, his unease deepening as they entered the jungle. The path was narrower this time, the dense foliage pressing close on either side. The air grew heavier, the vibrant colors of Neverland fading into muted greens and browns. The only sound was the steady crunch of footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. After what felt like hours, they emerged into a clearing. James blinked, his breath catching in his throat. Before them stretched a wide lagoon, its surface dark and still. Jagged rocks jutted out from the water, their edges sharp and gleaming. The trees that lined the shore were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something sharp and metallic. And then James saw them. The crocodiles. They were enormous, far larger than James had ever imagined. Their scaly bodies gleamed in the dim light, their tails swishing lazily through the water. One of them climbed onto the bank, its massive jaws parting slightly to reveal rows of jagged teeth. Its eyes gleamed like polished stones, unblinking and predatory. The boys murmured among themselves, their earlier excitement dampened by the sight. Peter, however, seemed unfazed. He strode toward the edge of the lagoon, his movements confident and almost theatrical. "They're incredible, aren't they?" he said, his voice filled with admiration. "Beautiful. Powerful." James felt his stomach churn. There was something unsettling about the way Peter spoke, as though he genuinely revered the creatures. "Why are we here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Peter turned to him, his grin sharp. To meet the real rulers of Neverland. The boys laughed nervously, but James couldn't join them. His eyes were fixed on the largest crocodile, the one lounging on the bank. Its scales were dull and scarred, its tail swaying with a steady rhythm. Tick-tock, tick-tock. That's tick-tock, Peter said, noticing James's gaze. She's the biggest, the meanest, and my personal favorite. Peter crouched by the water, picking up a small rock and tossing it lightly in his hand. You know, he said, his tone conversational. The crocodiles are more than just predators. They're part of the balance of Neverland. They help me keep things in order. What do you mean? James asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Peter's grin widened, his eyes gleaming with mischief. Neverland has rules, James. And the crocodiles, they help enforce them. The boys exchanged uneasy glances. Peter's tone was light, almost playful, but there was an edge to his words that made James's skin crawl. What kind of rules? James pressed. Peter's expression darkened briefly, but the grin returned quickly. The kind that keep us free. The kind that make sure no one forgets what it means to be a lost boy. He tossed the rock into the water, the splash echoing across the lagoon. The crocodiles didn't react, their eyes fixed on the group with cold, unblinking precision. Peter stood, brushing off his hands. Who wants to play a game? The boys hesitated, their unease palpable, but no one dared to refuse. Peter's games were never optional. What kind of game? Nibs asked cautiously. Peter's grin turned sly. It's simple. We'll take turns placing a pebble as close to Tick-Tock's jaws as we can. Whoever gets the closest without getting bitten wins. James's stomach dropped. That's not a game, he said before he could stop himself. That's dangerous. Peter's grin faltered for a moment, his eyes narrowing. What's wrong, James? Are you scared? James flushed, his hands clenching into fists. I just don't think it's a good idea. Peter stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. This is Neverland, James. We don't do things the way grown-ups do. If you're too scared to play, maybe you don't belong. The boys watched silently, their expressions a mix of pity and fear. James felt the weight of their gaze, the unspoken pressure to prove himself. I'll go first, Nibs said, suddenly, stepping forward. Peter's grin returned. Good boy, Nibs. Show them how it's done. One by one, the boys took their turns, each trying to outdo the last. Some placed their pebbles a safe distance from Tick-Tock's jaws, their hands trembling. Others pushed closer, their bravery driven more by fear of Peter than the desire to win. Finally, it was James's turn. Peter gestured toward the lagoon, his grin almost daring. Your turn, James. Don't disappoint me. James's legs felt like lead as he stepped forward. The other boys watched in tense silence, their earlier laughter gone. Tick-Tock's eyes flicked open, her gaze locking onto James as he approached. Her tail swished once, the sound unnervingly loud. Tick-Tock. James crouched by the water, his heart pounding. He picked up a small rock, his fingers trembling. He didn't want to do this, but Peter's grin was sharp and expectant, and the weight of the boy's eyes pressed down on him. Slowly, he placed the rock on the ground, just inches from Tick-Tock's jaws. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with terrifying speed, Tick-Tock's massive jaws snapped shut, missing his hand by mere inches. James stumbled back, his breath coming in short gasps. The boys erupted into cheers, but their voices seemed distant, muffled by the pounding of his heartbeat. Peter clapped him on the back, his grin wide and approving. "Not bad, James," he said. "Not bad at all." As the group made their way back to the hideout, James lagged behind, his mind racing. The game had been terrifying, but what unsettled him more was Peter's reaction. The boys' joy during the game hadn't been innocent or playful. It had been cruel. Peter wasn't just a leader. He was a ruler, and his power came not from loyalty, but from fear. That night, as the boys gathered around the fire, James sat apart, staring into the flames. Peter's laughter rang out, bright and carefree, but to James it sounded sharp and hollow. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Chapter 5. Games of Power. The air in the hideout was alive with energy. The lost boys bustled about, their laughter echoing through the cavern. Peter sat on a ledge above them, cross-legged, his dagger twirling lazily in his hand. He watched the chaos below with a sharp grin, his green eyes glinting like a cat's. James Hook sat off to the side, his back against the wall, observing the scene with a growing unease. Since the trip to Crocodile Lagoon, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had expected Neverland to be a paradise, a place of endless freedom and adventure. But the more time he spent here, the more cracks he saw in the illusion. "James!" Peter's voice rang out, startling him. Peter hopped down from his perch, landing lightly in front of him. "What are you doing sitting around? We've got a game to play." James hesitated. What kind of game? Peter's grin widened. The fun kind. The lost boys cheered as Peter clapped his hands, signaling for everyone to gather in the center of the cavern. James felt a knot tighten in his stomach as the boys crowded around, their faces eager but tinged with a nervous energy. Peter loved games, but his definition of fun often left James uneasy. Peter strode into the center of the circle, his movements confident and theatrical. Tinker Bell flitted above him, her golden light casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Today's game is simple," Peter announced, his voice commanding. "We're going to see who's the fastest, the strongest, and the bravest. It's every boy for himself." The boys murmured excitedly, though a few exchanged nervous glances. James frowned. "What do you mean, every boy for himself?" Peter smirked. "You'll see." He pointed to a stack of wooden swords and slingshots near the wall. "Grab a weapon. The rules are simple. You win by knocking out as many other boys as you can. The last one standing gets a prize." James stared at him, his stomach churning. "You want us to fight each other?" "Of course!" Peter's grin widened. "It's just a game, James. Don't tell me you're scared." James opened his mouth to protest, but the boys were already scrambling for weapons, their excitement drowning out his hesitation. Nibs grabbed a slingshot, flashing James a grin as he loaded it with a small pebble. "Come on, James. It's not as bad as it sounds." James reluctantly picked up a wooden sword, its weight unfamiliar in his hand. He glanced around the cavern, noting the tension in the air. The boys were smiling, laughing, but their movements were sharp, their eyes darting to Peter as though seeking his approval. Peter raised his dagger, signaling the start of the game. The boys scattered, their laughter mingling with the sound of wood clashing against wood. James stayed near the edge of the cavern, his grip tightening on the sword as he watched the chaos unfold. Nibs darted past, his slingshot snapping as he hit another boy square in the chest. The boy yelped, dropping his sword and falling to the ground. Nibs whooped, raising his arms in triumph before disappearing into the fray. James's heart raced as another boy charged toward him, his wooden sword swinging wildly. James barely managed to deflect the blow, the impact sending a jolt up his arm. He stumbled back, his breath coming in short gasps. "Fight back, James!" Peter called, his voice echoing through the cavern. "Don't just stand there!" James gritted his teeth, raising his sword to block another strike. The boy attacking him laughed, his movements clumsy but relentless. James felt a surge of frustration and swung his sword, knocking the other boy's weapon from his hand. The boy fell back, landing with a thud. For a moment, James felt a flicker of triumph. But as he looked around, he saw the exhaustion and fear on the other boys' faces. This wasn't fun. It wasn't a game. The game dragged on, the laughter growing fainter as more boys dropped out. James found himself cornered by two boys, their faces flushed with exertion. He raised his sword, his arms trembling, but before they could strike, a loud cry rang out. One of the younger boys had tripped and fallen into the shallow pool at the edge of the cavern. He thrashed in the water, his cries muffled as he struggled to keep his head above the surface. James dropped his sword and ran toward the pool, his heart pounding. He waded into the water, grabbing the boy by the arm and pulling him to safety. The boy coughed and sputtered, clinging to James as they climbed onto the bank. Peter appeared beside them, his grin sharp and unforgiving. "What are you doing, James? The game's not over." James glared at him, his chest heaving. He was drowning. Peter rolled his eyes. He would have been fine. "You're supposed to be playing, not babysitting." James stood, his fists clenched. "This isn't a game. It's dangerous." Peter's grin faded, his expression hardening. The cavern fell silent, the remaining boys watching with wide eyes. "You're starting to sound like a grown-up, James," Peter said, his voice low and dangerous. "And we don't like grown-ups here." James's breath caught in his throat. The tension in the room was palpable, the boys frozen as they waited for Peter's reaction. Finally, Peter laughed, the sound sharp and mocking. "Fine, be the hero, if that's what you want. But don't expect a prize." He turned and strode away, his movements quick and dismissive. Tinker Bell followed, her light flickering angrily. The other boys exchanged uneasy glances before resuming their game, their laughter forced and hollow. That night, James sat alone near the fire, his thoughts racing. The boy he had saved was asleep nearby, his face pale and his breathing steady. The other boys were scattered around the cavern, their energy subdued. Even Peter was unusually quiet, perched on a high root with his dagger in hand. James stared into the flames, his mind replaying the events of the day. Peter's words echoed in his ears. "You're starting to sound like a grown-up." He had meant it as an insult, but James couldn't help but wonder if it was true. Was that so bad? Wasn't being a grown-up better than this? Better than living in fear of a boy who called himself a leader but acted like a tyrant? The fire crackled, sending sparks into the air. James watched them rise, his unease growing. Neverland was supposed to be a place of freedom, of joy. But it was becoming harder to ignore the cracks in the illusion. As the flames flickered, casting shadows on the cavern walls, James made a silent vow. He wouldn't let Peter's games define him. He wouldn't become like the other boys, too afraid to question or resist. For the first time since arriving in Neverland, James began to see Peter Pan for what he truly was. Not a hero, but something far darker. Chapter 6. The Forbidden Questions. The hideout was quieter than usual. The aftermath of the previous day's game lingered in the air, dampening the boys' usual energy. James sat near the edge of the cavern, watching as the others went about their routines. Some were mending clothes, while others cleaned weapons or played half-heartedly with wooden swords. Peter was nowhere to be seen, his absence a strange, almost palpable void. James sighed, his thoughts heavy. The more time he spent in Neverland, the more questions he had. But there was one question that weighed heavier than the rest. What happens to the boys who disappear? Since his arrival, James had noticed the gaps in the group, the names whispered quietly, the hammocks that no one touched. He had assumed at first that the missing boys had left Neverland, returned home to their families. But now, he wasn't so sure. "James!" He turned to see Elias standing behind him, his expression cautious. Elias was one of the quieter boys, older than most, but smaller in stature. He rarely joined the others in their games, preferring instead to linger on the outskirts, observing. "Can we talk?" Elias asked, his voice barely above a whisper. James nodded, curiosity sparking despite his unease. "What's on your mind?" "Not here." Elias glanced around, his eyes darting to the shadows where Tinker Bell often lurked. "Follow me." Elias led James through a narrow tunnel that wound deep into the heart of the tree. The air grew cooler as they descended, the light from the cavern fading into shadows. Finally, they reached a small alcove where a flickering lantern cast a dim, golden glow. Elias sat on a rock, gesturing for James to do the same. "I saw what you did yesterday," he said, "pulling that boy out of the water. That was brave." James shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. It was the right thing to do. "Not everyone would have done it," Elias said quietly. He paused, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "You're new here, so maybe you haven't noticed yet. But Peter, he's not who he seems." James frowned. "What do you mean?" Elias hesitated, his eyes flicking to the tunnel entrance. "Peter thrives on control," he said finally. "He needs us to follow him, to believe in him. That's where his magic comes from. Belief. But it's more than that. It's fear, too." James's chest tightened. He had felt it, the subtle undercurrent of fear that kept the boys in line. But hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way he wasn't prepared for. "What happens to the boys who leave?" he asked. Elias's expression darkened. "They don't leave, James. They're taken." "Taken?" James echoed, his voice barely a whisper. Elias nodded. When a boy stops believing, when he starts asking too many questions, Peter says they're lost. But they don't just disappear. He takes them to the crocodiles. James felt a chill crawl down his spine. "You're saying he kills them?" Elias didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was trembling. "I've seen it happen. He doesn't do it himself, he lets TikTok do it. But he watches, James. He watches. And he smiles." James's mind raced, his breath coming in short gasps. He wanted to deny it, to tell Elias he was wrong. But the memory of TikTok's snapping jaws was fresh in his mind, and Peter's grin, sharp, almost cruel, haunted him. "Why are you telling me this?" James asked. "Because I think you're different," Elias said. "You don't follow Peter blindly like the others. You see him for what he really is." James shook his head, his voice trembling. I don't know what I see. Elias placed a hand on his shoulder. Just be careful. Don't let him know you're questioning him. If he finds out... Elias didn't finish the sentence, but the warning was clear. James returned to the main cavern with Elias's words ringing in his ears. The other boys were gathered around a fire, their laughter forced and brittle. Peter had returned, his presence once again dominating the space. He sat cross-legged on a high root, spinning his dagger idly in one hand. Tinker Bell flitted nearby, her light casting sharp, flickering shadows. "James!" Peter called, his tone light but edged with something darker. "Come join us. We were just talking about today's adventure." James forced a smile, his legs feeling like lead as he walked toward the fire. He could feel Peter's eyes on him, sharp and searching, as though he could sense the doubt creeping into James's heart. "What kind of adventure?" James asked, keeping his voice steady. Peter grinned, his teeth glinting in the firelight. "You'll see." James's stomach churned. He could see the way the other boys looked at Peter, the forced enthusiasm in their smiles, the nervous glances they exchanged when they thought he wasn't looking. They were afraid, just like Elias had said. And for the first time, James realized he was too. The next morning, James woke to the sound of shouting. He stumbled out of his hammock, his heart racing, and followed the noise to the main cavern. A group of boys was gathered near the center, their faces pale and tense. In the middle of the circle stood Elias, his hands bound behind his back. "What's going on?" James demanded, pushing through the crowd. Peter stood nearby, his expression cold. "Elias has been talking out of turn," he said, his voice devoid of its usual charm. "Spreading lies." James' blood ran cold. What kind of lies? Peter's gaze shifted to James, his grin returning, though it didn't reach his eyes. "About me. About Neverland." Elias's eyes met James's, filled with fear and regret. "I didn't." "Silence!" Peter's shout echoed through the cavern, silencing the crowd. He turned back to the boys, his smile sharp. "You all know the rules. No one questions me. No one spreads doubt, because doubt is poison, and poison destroys everything we've built." James's fists clenched at his sides. "He didn't mean any harm." Peter's eyes narrowed. "And how would you know that, James?" The question hung in the air, heavy with accusation. James felt every eye in the cavern turn to him, their stares a mix of fear and curiosity. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Peter stepped closer to Elias, his dagger gleaming in his hand. "I think a night alone will help Elias remember the rules." He gestured to two boys, who dragged Elias away, despite his protests. James watched, his heart pounding, as Elias disappeared into the shadows. That night, James lay awake in his hammock, his thoughts racing. Peter's actions had confirmed everything Elias had said. He ruled through fear, his charm a mask for something far darker. And now, Elias was paying the price for speaking the truth. James stared at the ceiling of the cavern, the flickering light of the fire casting dancing shadows. He felt trapped, caught between his growing distrust of Peter and his fear of what would happen if he spoke out. The other boys were silent, their unease palpable. For the first time since arriving in Neverland, James felt the weight of its magic pressing down on him, suffocating and inescapable. The land that had promised freedom and adventure now felt like a prison, and its ruler was a boy who would stop at nothing to maintain his power. As James closed his eyes, he made a silent vow. He would find a way to uncover the truth. And when he did, he would make Peter pay. Chapter 7. The Price of Eternity. The next morning broke over Neverland in a haze of golden light. But for James, the warmth of the sun did little to ease the cold knot in his stomach. The cavern was quieter than usual, the boys moving with an uncharacteristic tension. Peter was nowhere to be seen. But his absence didn't feel like relief. It felt like the calm before a storm. James sat near the edge of the cavern, staring into the jungle beyond. The events of the previous day weighed heavily on him. Elias was gone, dragged into the shadows for daring to question Peter. No one spoke of him. No one even looked at the hammock where he used to sleep. The silence was deafening, and James hated it. "James!" Peter's voice rang out, sharp and bright, breaking the uneasy quiet. James turned to see Peter striding toward him, his grin as wide as ever, though his eyes glinted with something colder. "Come with me," Peter said. "I've got something special planned for today." James hesitated. "Where are we going?" Peter laughed, the sound light, but unnerving. "It's a surprise. Just the two of us." The knot in James's stomach tightened, but he forced a smile and nodded. "All right." Peter's grin widened, and without another word, he turned and headed into the jungle. James followed, his heart pounding with every step. The jungle seemed denser than ever, the towering trees blotting out the sun and casting long shadows across the ground. The air was thick and humid, the sounds of birds and insects a constant hum around them. Peter moved through the undergrowth with ease, his steps light and confident. James struggled to keep up, the weight of his unease slowing his movements. "Where are we going?" James asked again, his voice tight. Peter glanced back, his grin sharp. "You'll see. It's a part of Neverland most boys don't get to visit." James frowned. "Why not?" Peter shrugged, his tone casual. "It's not for everyone, but I think you're ready." They walked in silence for what felt like hours, the jungle growing darker and quieter with every step. The vibrant colors of Neverland faded into muted greens and browns, and the air grew colder. James's unease deepened, his mind racing with questions he didn't dare ask. Finally, they emerged into a small clearing. In the center stood a boy, his back to them. He was older than the Lost Boys, his frame taller and his shoulders broader. His clothes were ragged, his hair unkempt. He stood still, his head bowed as though waiting for something. "Who's that?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Peter's grin faltered for a moment, his expression darkening. "Someone who's outlived his welcome." James's chest tightened as he looked at the boy. There was something haunting about him, a sense of loss and emptiness that made James's skin crawl. "What do you mean?" he asked. Peter's grin returned, though it was colder. Now, more calculated. "Neverland is a place for youth, for belief. But sometimes, boys forget. They start to grow up." James stared at Peter, his stomach churning. "I thought no one grows up in Neverland." Peter shrugged. "Not unless they stop believing. And when that happens, they don't belong here anymore." The boy turned then, his eyes meeting James's. They were dull, lifeless, filled with a quiet despair that made James's breath catch. His face was gaunt, his features etched with lines that didn't belong on a child. "What happens to him?" James asked, though he already feared the answer. Peter's grin widened, his eyes glinting with something cruel. He becomes part of the balance. James frowned. What does that mean? Peter didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. The boy didn't flinch, didn't move, as Peter placed a hand on his shoulder. Come on, Peter said, his tone almost gentle. It's time. The boy didn't resist, as Peter led him toward the edge of the clearing. James followed, his heart pounding. The sound of water reached his ears, faint at first, but growing louder with every step. They emerged onto the shore of a small lagoon, its surface dark and still. And then James saw them. The crocodiles. The crocodiles were enormous, their scaly bodies glinting in the dim light. Their eyes gleamed like polished stones, unblinking and predatory. The largest of them lounged on the shore, her massive jaws parted slightly, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Tick-tock. James's breath caught in his throat as Peter led the boy closer to the water. The crocodiles stirred, their tails swishing lazily as they turned their attention to the newcomers. "Peter," James said, his voice trembling. "What are you doing?" Peter glanced back, his grin sharp. "Keeping Neverland pure." Before James could respond, Peter stepped back, leaving the boy standing alone at the water's edge. The crocodiles moved closer, their movements slow and deliberate. The boy didn't resist, didn't run. He simply stood there, his eyes empty. Tick-tock lunged, her jaws snapping shut around the boy with a sickening crunch. James stumbled back, his stomach lurching as bile rose in his throat. He turned away, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Peter's laughter rang out, bright and carefree. "See? Balance restored." James spun to face him, his fists clenched. "How can you call that balance? You just let him die." Peter's grin didn't falter. He didn't belong here anymore, James. He stopped believing. And in Neverland, that's the price you pay. The walk back to the hideout was silent. James kept his distance from Peter, his mind racing with questions and accusations he couldn't voice. He replayed the scene over and over, the image of Tick-tock's snapping jaws seared into his memory. When they reached the hideout, Peter clapped him on the back, his grin as sharp as ever. "You did well today, James. Not everyone can handle seeing the balance firsthand." James didn't respond. He watched as Peter strode into the cavern, the other boys flocking to him like moths to a flame. Their laughter echoed through the space, bright and hollow. James retreated to his hammock, his thoughts heavy. Neverland was not the paradise he had imagined. It was a place of rules, of consequences, of fear. And Peter Pan, the boy who had promised freedom and adventure, was its cruel, unrelenting ruler. For the first time, James felt the weight of his choice to come here. And for the first time, he wondered if he would ever be able to leave. Chapter 8. Elias's Fate. The fire in the cavern burned low, its embers casting faint, flickering shadows on the walls. The usual hum of activity from the Lost Boys was subdued, replaced by tense murmurs and sidelong glances. James Hook sat near the edge of the cavern, his gaze fixed on the empty hammock where Elias had once slept. It had been 2 days since Elias was dragged away for questioning, 2 days since Peter had declared him a traitor, accused him of spreading doubt among the group. And now the silence surrounding his absence was deafening. No one spoke of him, as though even his name had been erased from memory. But James couldn't forget. "Where is he?" James asked, his voice breaking the uneasy quiet. The boys around him flinched, their eyes darting toward the shadows where Peter often lingered. No one answered. Someone has to know, James pressed, his voice rising. He didn't just vanish. Shut up, James, Nibs hissed, his face pale. Peter will hear you. James's jaw tightened. Good. Let him. Before anyone could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the cavern. The boys froze, their gazes snapping toward the entrance. A figure emerged from the shadows, his steps slow and unsteady. Elias. James's breath caught in his throat. Elias looked pale and gaunt, his once bright eyes dull and sunken. His shoulders sagged under the weight of an invisible burden, and his movements were hesitant, as though he were unsure of his place. "Elias!" James called, rushing toward him. Elias flinched at the sound of his name, his gaze darting around the cavern. When his eyes met James's, they filled with a mixture of relief and fear. "James," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "What happened to you?" James asked, gripping Elias's arm. "Where did they take you?" Elias opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Peter stepped into the cavern. His presence was like a storm cloud, filling the space with tension. The boys scrambled to their feet, their expressions a mix of awe and fear. Well, Peter said, his grin sharp. "Look who's back." Elias stiffened, his gaze dropping to the ground. James stepped in front of him, his fists clenched. "What did you do to him?" Peter's grin faltered for a moment, but his eyes remained cold. "I reminded him of the rules." James glared at him. "What rules?" "The rules that keep Neverland safe," Peter said, his voice growing sharper. "The rules that keep us free. And Elias forgot them." Elias flinched, his body trembling. James's chest tightened as he looked between Elias and Peter, the unspoken threat hanging heavy in the air. Over the next few days, Elias withdrew further into himself. He rarely spoke, his once lively spirit replaced by a quiet despair. The other boys avoided him, their glances filled with unease and pity. Even Nibs, who had always been quick to offer a kind word, kept his distance. James stayed close to Elias, refusing to let him disappear into the shadows. But the more time he spent with him, the more he noticed the changes. Elias's face grew thinner, his movements slower. And then there were the other signs, the faint lines around his eyes, the streaks of grey in his hair. He was aging. James confronted him one evening as they sat near the fire, the other boys watching from a cautious distance. "Elias," James said, his voice low, "what's happening to you?" Elias hesitated, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "I've stopped believing," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. James frowned. "Believing in what?" "In Peter," Elias said, his gaze fixed on the fire. "In Neverland." James's breath caught. The weight of Elias's words hit him like a blow. "You don't think it's real?" Elias shook his head. "I think it's real. But it's not what Peter says it is. It's not freedom. It's control." James stared at him, his mind racing. He had felt it too, the cracks in the illusion, the fear that lingered beneath the surface. But hearing Elias say it aloud made it real in a way he wasn't ready for. "What happens now?" James asked, though he feared the answer. Elias's expression darkened. "You know what happens." The next morning, Peter called a meeting. The boys gathered in the main cavern, their expressions wary. Peter stood on a high root, his presence commanding as he looked down at them. Tinker Bell hovered beside him, her light flickering like an angry flame. "We have a problem," Peter announced, his voice sharp. "One of us has forgotten what it means to be a lost boy." The boys exchanged nervous glances. James felt his chest tighten as Peter's gaze shifted to Elias. "Elias has stopped believing," Peter said, his tone dripping with disdain. "He's stopped playing by the rules, and now he's becoming something he shouldn't be." Elias stood frozen, his face pale. James stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You can't blame him for growing up," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "It's not his fault." Peter's grin faltered, and for a moment his eyes glinted with something darker. "Do you want to take his place, James?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. James's breath caught in his throat. The cavern fell silent, every eye on him. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Peter stepped down from the root, his movements slow and deliberate. "Elias," he said, his tone soft but menacing. "You know the rules." Elias didn't resist as two boys stepped forward and grabbed his arms. He didn't protest as they dragged him toward the exit, his feet dragging on the ground. But as he passed James, he turned his head, his eyes meeting his for the briefest moment. "Don't let this happen to you," Elias whispered, and then he was gone. James followed at a distance, his heart pounding. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't let Elias be another sacrifice to TikTok. But when he reached the lagoon, it was already too late. Elias stood at the water's edge, his shoulders slumped. The crocodiles stirred in the water, their eyes gleaming in the dim light. Peter stood nearby, his expression cold and unyielding. "Goodbye, Elias," Peter said, his voice devoid of emotion. TikTok lunged, her massive jaws snapping shut around Elias in a sickening crunch. James stumbled back, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He turned away, unable to watch, but the sound would haunt him forever. Peter's laughter rang out, bright and hollow. "That's the price of forgetting," he said, his tone light. "The price of growing up." That night, James lay in his hammock, his thoughts racing. Elias was gone, just like the others. And Peter, charming, charismatic Peter, was a murderer. The illusion of Neverland had shattered, and in its place was a cold, unrelenting truth. Peter wasn't a savior. He was a tyrant. As James stared at the cavern ceiling, he made a silent vow. He would find a way to stop Peter, to end the cycle of fear and control, even if it meant risking everything. Chapter 9. The Rebellion. The days after Elias's death were heavy with silence. The lost boys carried on as if nothing had happened, their laughter forced, their games hollow. No one spoke of Elias. His name was a ghost that lingered in the shadows, unspoken, but ever present. James Hook couldn't bear it. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw TikTok's jaws closing, heard the sickening crunch, and felt the weight of his own inaction. It wasn't just Elias. It was all of them. The boys who had disappeared, erased from memory, and replaced by the ever-present shadow of Peter Pan's control. James had come to Neverland seeking adventure, but what he had found was something far darker. He had to do something. The idea came to him in the dead of night, as he lay awake in his hammock, staring at the cavern's ceiling. Peter's charm and power thrived on the boys' belief in him, their fear keeping them in line. If James could convince the others to see the truth, to stand up to Peter, maybe they could break free. But he couldn't do it alone. James's thoughts turned to Tiger Lily. He remembered the fierce defiance in her eyes during their first encounter, the way she had stood up to Peter, even in the face of his mockery. She had called him a trespasser, an invader. Perhaps she knew the truth about Peter better than anyone. The next morning, James slipped away from the hideout, his heart pounding with every step. The jungle seemed alive with whispers, the trees looming like silent witnesses to his rebellion. He pushed through the undergrowth, his mind racing with questions. Would Tiger Lily even speak to him? Could she be trusted? And what would happen if Peter found out? James found Tiger Lily near the edge of the jungle. Her tribe gathered around a small fire. They were sharpening weapons and painting their faces with bold, bright colors. The sight of them sent a pang of guilt through James's chest. He had been part of the ambush, part of the humiliation Peter had inflicted on them. Tiger Lily noticed him immediately, her sharp eyes narrowing. She stood, her movements fluid and deliberate, and approached him with a blade in hand. "What do you want, lost boy?" she asked, her voice cold. James hesitated, his pulse quickening. "I need your help." Tiger Lily tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Help with what? Another ambush? Another game?" "No," James said quickly, his voice trembling. I know what Peter is. I know what he's done." Tiger Lily's eyes darkened. "Do you?" James nodded, his hands clenching into fists. "He's a liar, a murderer. He's not a leader. He's a tyrant." Tiger Lily studied him for a long moment, her gaze piercing. Finally, she lowered her blade. "Come with me." She led James to a quiet clearing, away from the prying eyes of her tribe. "What do you know?" she asked, her tone cautious. James took a deep breath. "I know he takes boys who stop believing. I know he feeds them to the crocodiles. And I know he'll do anything to stay in control." Tiger Lily's expression hardened. "It's worse than that." James frowned. "What do you mean?" Tiger Lily sat on a fallen log, her posture tense. "Peter isn't just keeping control. He's keeping himself young. Neverland's magic is tied to belief, but it's also tied to sacrifice. The boys he takes, the ones he calls traitors, they're not just food for the crocodiles. They're the reason Peter never grows up." James's stomach churned. "You're saying he sacrifices them to stay young?" Tiger Lily nodded. "As long as the boys believe in him, and as long as he offers the crocodiles their due, Peter remains eternal. But it's a fragile balance. If the belief falters, if the sacrifices stop, Neverland would change, and so would he." James sat in stunned silence, Tiger Lily's words echoing in his mind. Peter's charm, his power, his eternal youth, it was all built on lies and blood, and James had been a part of it. "We have to stop him," James said finally, his voice shaking. "We have to show the others the truth." Tiger Lily studied him, her expression skeptical. "The lost boys won't listen. They're too afraid, too loyal." "Not all of them," James said. "Some of them are starting to see it, starting to question. If I can convince them, we can fight back. We can end this." Tiger Lily's gaze softened, a hint of respect flickering in her eyes. "It's a dangerous path you're choosing, James Hook. Peter doesn't forgive betrayal." James straightened, his jaw tightening. "I don't care. Someone has to stop him." Tiger Lily nodded slowly. "If you're serious about this, I'll help you. But you need to be careful. If Peter finds out what you're planning, he'll kill you. James's breath hitched, but he forced himself to nod. I understand. James returned to the hideout with a renewed sense of purpose, though his heart still pounded with fear. He couldn't confront Peter directly. Not yet. First, he needed allies. He sought out Nibs, finding him near the edge of the cavern, carving shapes into a piece of wood. Nibs looked up as James approached, his expression wary. "What's up?" Nibs asked, his tone casual but guarded. James sat beside him, lowering his voice. "I need to talk to you. It's important." Nibs frowned. "About what?" "About Peter," James said, "and about what he's hiding." Nibs stiffened, his gaze darting around the cavern. "Keep your voice down," he hissed. "Do you want him to hear you?" James leaned closer, his voice urgent. "You've seen it, haven't you? The way he controls us. The way he gets rid of the boys who stop believing." Nibs hesitated, his grip tightening on the piece of wood in his hands. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, I do," James said, his voice firm. "I've seen it, and I know you have too." Nibs's shoulders sagged, and for a moment he looked older than his years. "What do you want me to do?" "Help me," James said. "We can't fight him alone, but if we stand together, if we show the others the truth, we can stop him." Nibs stared at him, his expression torn. Finally, he nodded. "I'll help. But if this goes wrong—" James placed a hand on his shoulder. "It won't." Over the next few days, James and Nibs worked quietly, planting seeds of doubt among the other boys. They spoke in hushed whispers, careful to avoid Peter's watchful gaze. It was slow, dangerous work, but the cracks in Peter's control began to show. Not all the boys were willing to listen. Many were too afraid, too loyal. But a few began to question, their belief in Peter wavering. James could see it in their eyes. The same doubt that had been growing in his own heart since the day he arrived. But Peter wasn't blind. He could sense the shift, the subtle change in the boys' attitudes. And as his grip began to slip, his temper grew shorter, his punishments more severe. James knew it was only a matter of time before Peter discovered the truth. And when he did, the rebellion would begin. Chapter 10. The Confrontation. The air in the cavern was thick with tension, an unspoken unease rippling through the lost boys. Peter had been quieter than usual over the past few days, his sharp grins less frequent, his piercing gaze more watchful. James Hook felt the weight of the gaze now as he stood near the fire, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The boys around him laughed and talked, but their voices were strained, their movements careful. Peter sat on his usual perch, cross-legged and silent, his dagger spinning lazily in his hand. His green eyes scanned the room, lingering briefly on James before moving on. Tinker Bell flitted around him, her golden light flickering erratically, as though reflecting her master's growing agitation. James exchanged a glance with Nibs, who stood on the other side of the cavern. The plan was set. Tonight, they would confront Peter, expose his lies, and rally the boys to stand against him. It was a desperate gamble, but James knew they were running out of time. Peter's grip on the group was tightening, and every day that passed, more boys fell into line, their doubts silenced by fear. It was now or never. Peter clapped his hands, and the boys fell silent. "Dinner time!" he called, his voice bright and commanding. The lost boys cheered, though the sound was half-hearted. Plates and mugs appeared on the long wooden table, conjured from thin air by Peter's magic. The food looked sumptuous. Roasted meats, steaming pies, fresh fruit. But James knew better now. It wasn't real, until they believed it was. James sat at the edge of the table, barely touching his plate. His appetite had disappeared, replaced by a gnawing anxiety that coiled in his stomach. He watched as the other boys ate, laughing and joking with a forced cheerfulness that made his skin crawl. Peter sat at the head of the table, his grin wide and sharp, but his eyes never stopped moving, scanning the group with predatory intensity. Tinker Bell landed on Peter's shoulder, her light dimming as she whispered something in his ear. Peter's grin faltered for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at James. James's heart skipped a beat, but he forced himself to meet Peter's gaze, his expression calm. The time was coming. As the feast wound down, Peter stood, raising his dagger high. The boys fell silent, their eyes fixed on him. "My brothers," Peter began, his voice loud and commanding, "tonight we celebrate. We celebrate the freedom of Neverland, the joy of being lost boys, and the magic that keeps us young and alive." The boys cheered, though the sound was muted. James felt his chest tighten. He could see the cracks in their belief, the doubt that lingered just beneath the surface. It was time to push those cracks wide open. He stood, his voice cutting through the noise. "What magic, Peter?" The room fell silent. Every eye turned to James, their expressions a mix of shock and fear. Peter's grin froze, his dagger lowering slightly. "What did you say?" Peter asked, his voice dangerously soft. James stepped forward, his heart pounding. "What magic keeps us young? Keeps you young? Is it the belief of the boys? Or is it something darker?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Peter's grin disappeared, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "Careful, James," he said. "You're treading on dangerous ground." James pressed on, his voice growing stronger. "We've all seen it. The boys who stop believing, the ones who disappear. They're not lost, Peter. You take them to tick-tock." The murmurs grew louder. Some of the boys looked at Peter, their expressions wary. Others stared at James, their faces pale with fear. Peter's dagger glinted in the firelight as he stepped down from his perch, his movements slow and deliberate. "You don't know what you're talking about," Peter said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're confused." "No, I'm not," James shot back. "You've been lying to us, manipulating us. You're not a leader, Peter. You're a tyrant." The cavern erupted into chaos. Some of the boys shouted in confusion, their voices clashing as they argued. Others sat frozen, their eyes darting between James and Peter. Nibs stood, his voice cutting through the noise. "James is right," he shouted. "We've all seen it. The way Peter punishes anyone who questions him, the way he feeds the crocodiles." The murmur grew into a roar. Boys stood on both sides of the argument, their voices clashing as the group split down the middle. Peter's grin returned, but it was sharp and cold, his eyes glinting with malice. "Traitors," he said softly, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Both of you." James stepped forward, his fists clenched. "We're not traitors, Peter. We're the ones who see the truth. And soon, the others will too." Peter's grin widened, and he raised his dagger, pointing it at James. "If you want to play hero, James, you'd better be ready to lose." Peter lunged, his movements quick and fluid. James barely had time to react, grabbing a wooden sword from the table to block the strike. The sound of metal clashing against wood echoed through the cavern, silencing the arguing boys. The fight was brutal, Peter's strikes fast and relentless. James struggled to keep up, his heart pounding as he parried blow after blow. Around them, the boys watched in stunned silence, their faces pale. "You think you can stop me?" Peter sneered, his dagger slashing through the air. "You're nothing, James. Just another scared little boy." James gritted his teeth, blocking another strike. "Maybe, but at least I'm not a liar." Peter's grin faltered, his eyes narrowing. He lunged again, but this time James sidestepped, swinging his wooden sword in a wide arc. The blow caught Peter on the side, knocking him off balance. The boys erupted into shouts, their voices a mix of encouragement and fear. Peter recovered quickly, his movements sharper, more aggressive. James knew he couldn't win this fight, not alone. "Nibs!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the cavern. Nibs hesitated for a moment, then grabbed a slingshot from the table. He loaded it with a sharp pebble, aiming carefully before letting it fly. The pebble struck Peter's hand, sending the dagger clattering to the ground. Peter's eyes blazed with fury as he turned to Nibs. "Traitor!" he spat. James seized the opportunity, stepping between Peter and Nibs. "It's over, Peter. The boys know the truth now. They won't follow you anymore." Peter's grin returned, sharp and dangerous. "We'll see about that." Peter stormed out of the cavern, his movements quick and furious. Tinker Bell followed, her light flickering like an angry flame. The Lost Boys watched him go, their expressions a mix of fear and uncertainty. James turned to face the group, his chest heaving. "You don't have to follow him," he said, his voice steady. "We can be free. We can make our own choices." The boys exchanged glances, their doubt and fear written plainly on their faces. Slowly, a few of them nodded, stepping toward James. Others remained where they were, their loyalty to Peter unshaken. Nibs placed a hand on James's shoulder, his voice low. "You did it. You stood up to him." James shook his head. "It's not over. Peter's not going to let this go." As the boys began to talk among themselves, James felt the weight of what had just happened settle over him. He had challenged Peter Pan, shattered the illusion of Neverland's perfect freedom. But the fight was far from over. In the shadows beyond the cavern, Peter's laughter echoed, sharp and cold. Chapter 11. The Hand of Betrayal. The jungle was quiet, the air heavy with the weight of what had happened. James Hook crouched low in the underbrush, his breathing shallow, as he scanned the shadows around him. The moonlight filtered through the dense canopy above, casting dappled patterns on the ground. Somewhere in the distance, the faint ticking of a crocodile's tail echoed through the night. Tick, tock, tick, tock. James's hand gripped the hilt of his wooden sword, its edges worn smooth from countless games that now felt like a lifetime ago. The memory of Peter's cold, mocking grin still burned in his mind. The fight in the cavern had been the first step, but Peter wasn't one to back down. He was hunting them now, hunting him. And James knew this was no game. A rustling in the bushes made him freeze. He held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest as he waited. Slowly, a figure emerged from the shadows. "James," Nibs whispered, his voice low but urgent. "It's me." James relaxed slightly, lowering his sword. "Did you find the others?" Nibs nodded, his face pale in the moonlight. "A few of them. They're hiding near the river. But Peter, he's close. He's got Tink with him." James cursed under his breath. Tinker Bell's light made her an almost impossible scout to evade, and Peter's knowledge of the jungle was unmatched. He could be anywhere, waiting, watching. "We need to keep moving," James said. If he finds us out here, it's over. Nibs hesitated, his expression grim. What if we split up? He can't chase all of us at once. James shook his head. That's what he wants. We're stronger together. They moved carefully through the jungle, the underbrush whispering beneath their feet. The night was alive with the sounds of Neverland's creatures, but to James, every noise felt like a threat. The shadows seemed to shift and twist around them, the trees looming like silent sentinels. Suddenly a sharp laugh rang out, breaking the stillness. James froze, his grip tightening on his sword. The laugh was bright and carefree, but it carried an edge of malice that sent a chill down his spine. "James," Peter's voice called, sing-song and mocking. Come out, wherever you are." Nibs glanced at James, his eyes wide with fear. James held a finger to his lips, signaling for silence. They crept forward, keeping low, their breaths shallow. The laugh came again, closer this time. And then, without warning, Tinker Bell's golden light burst through the trees, illuminating the clearing ahead. James's heart sank as he saw Peter standing in the center, his dagger gleaming in the moonlight. "There you are," Peter said, his grin wide and sharp. "I've been looking for you." James stepped into the clearing, his wooden sword raised. Behind him, Nibs and a handful of other boys lingered at the edge of the trees, their faces pale but determined. "You don't have to do this, Peter," James said, his voice steady despite the fear tightening in his chest. "Let us go." Peter tilted his head, his grin never faltering. "Let you go? But where would the fun be in that?" "This isn't fun," James shot back. "It's not a game anymore. You're hurting people, killing people. Don't you see that?" Peter's grin faded, his eyes narrowing. "I see a traitor. I see someone who thinks he's better than me. But you're just like all the others, James. And you know what happens to boys who betray me." James tightened his grip on the sword. "I'm not afraid of you." Peter's grin returned, colder now. "You should be." He lunged. The fight was swift and brutal. Peter moved like a shadow, his strikes quick and precise. James parried desperately, his wooden sword clashing against Peter's dagger. The other boys shouted encouragement from the trees, but they didn't dare step forward. "You think you can beat me?" Peter sneered, his dagger slashing through the air. "I am Neverland, James. You're nothing without me." James gritted his teeth, blocking another strike. "Maybe. But at least I'm not a murderer." Peter's eyes blazed with fury. He lunged again, and this time James wasn't fast enough. The dagger sliced across his arm, pain flaring as blood seeped through his shirt. He stumbled back, his vision blurring. Peter advanced, his grin widening. "You should have stayed loyal, James. You should have known better." James tried to block the next strike, but Peter was faster. With a swift, brutal motion, Peter slashed downward, the blade catching James's left hand. Pain exploded through him, white-hot and blinding. He fell to his knees, clutching his wrist as blood poured onto the ground. Peter stood over him, his dagger dripping red. "This is what happens to boys who forget their place." James gasped for breath, the pain radiating through his entire body. He felt weak, helpless. But then he looked up, meeting Peter's eyes, and something inside him hardened. "You'll never control me," James spat, his voice shaking but defiant. Peter's grin faltered for the briefest moment. Then he bent down, scooping up James's severed hand. With a casual flick of his wrist, he tossed it into the lagoon. The water rippled, and then TikTok's massive jaws snapped shut, swallowing the hand whole. The ticking sound grew louder, echoing through the clearing, like a grim reminder. "That's where traitors belong," Peter said, his voice cold. Before Peter could strike again, a sharp cry rang out. Tiger Lily and her warriors burst into the clearing, their weapons gleaming in the moonlight. They moved with precision, surrounding Peter and forcing him to retreat. "Go!" Tiger Lily shouted at James. "We'll hold him off!" Nibs and the other boys rushed forward, helping James to his feet. His vision swam, the pain nearly overwhelming, but he forced himself to move. Together, they disappeared into the jungle, leaving Peter's furious shouts behind. They didn't stop until they reached the river, where Tiger Lily's warriors joined them. James collapsed onto the ground, his breath ragged, his body trembling. Tiger Lily knelt beside him, her expression grim. "You're lucky to be alive," she said, her tone sharp but not unkind. James looked up at her, his face pale. "It's not over. He's going to come after us." Tiger Lily nodded. "Then we'll be ready." That night, as the others tended to his wounds, James stared at the dark waters of the river. The pain in his hand was a constant throb, a brutal reminder of Peter's cruelty. But it wasn't just pain. It was fuel. Peter had taken everything from him. His trust, his innocence, his hand. But he hadn't broken him. James clenched his remaining fist, his jaw tightening. "I'll make him pay," he whispered. "I'll stop him, no matter what it takes." The moonlight glinted off the water, the sound of TikTok's tail echoing in the distance. James closed his eyes, his vow burning like fire in his chest. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Chapter 12. The Great Escape. The river's steady murmur filled the air, its dark waters glinting under the pale light of the moon. James Hook sat on the riverbank, his back against a tree, his breath shallow and labored. His left arm throbbed, the stump where his hand had been wrapped tightly in makeshift bandages by Tiger Lily's warriors. The pain was excruciating, but it wasn't just his body that hurt. Peter had taken his hand, thrown it to TikTok without hesitation. James clenched his remaining fist, the memory burning in his mind. He could still see Peter's grin, hear the mocking laughter as his severed hand disappeared into the crocodile's jaws. He would never forget, and he would never forgive. The lost boys who had sided with James gathered nearby, their faces pale and anxious. Nibs sat closest to James, his slingshot still in hand, though his fingers trembled as he loaded it with a smooth stone. Tiger Lily's warriors stood at the edge of the clearing, their painted faces calm but watchful. "We can't stay here," Tiger Lily said, her voice low and steady. She crouched beside James, her sharp eyes scanning the jungle. "Peter will come. It's only a matter of time." James nodded, though the simple motion sent a wave of pain through his body. "We need to leave Neverland," he said, his voice hoarse. "Find a way back to the real world." Tiger Lily frowned. "Do you even know how?" James hesitated. The truth was, he didn't. Peter had brought him here, and he had no idea how to return. But he couldn't admit that. Not now. "There has to be a way," he said firmly. "If Peter brought us here, then there's a way out." Tiger Lily studied him for a moment before nodding. "The portal. It's real. But it's well hidden." "Do you know where it is?" James asked. She hesitated. "I've heard stories. It's near the cliffs, past the Mermaid's Lagoon, but it won't be easy to reach. Peter controls those waters." James's jaw tightened. Then we'll have to be faster than him. They set off at dawn, moving quietly through the jungle. The air was cool, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the dense canopy above. Tiger Lily led the way, her warriors flanking the group to guard against an ambush. James walked near the center, his steps unsteady, but determined. Nibs stayed close, his eyes darting nervously toward the shadows. The jungle was alive with sound. Birds calling from the treetops, leaves rustling in the breeze. But beneath the natural chorus, there was something else, something darker. James could feel it, a presence that lingered just out of sight. He knew Peter was close. They reached the edge of the mermaid's lagoon by midday. The water was eerily calm, its surface shimmering like liquid glass. In the distance, James could see the rocky cliffs Tiger Lily had described, their jagged edges cutting into the sky. "We need to move quickly," Tiger Lily said, her voice low. "The mermaids won't bother us if we stay close to the shore. But if Peter finds us—" "He won't," James said, though his words sounded hollow, even to him. "We won't let him." The group moved cautiously along the shoreline, their eyes scanning the water for any sign of movement. The mermaids were visible in the distance, their shimmering tails breaking the surface as they lounged on the rocks. They watched the group with curious, calculating eyes, but they didn't approach. James's heart pounded with every step. The cliffs were close now, their dark shadows stretching across the lagoon. He could almost see the portal in his mind, a shimmering doorway that would take them back to the real world. Back to safety. But safety was an illusion in Neverland. A sharp cry rang out from behind them, followed by the sound of rustling leaves. James spun around, his stomach dropping as he saw a golden light darting through the trees. Tinker Bell. "She's here," Nibs whispered, his voice trembling. "That means—" "Peter," James finished, his voice grim. "Run!" The group broke into a sprint, the jungle exploding into chaos around them. Tinker Bell's light zipped through the trees, casting eerie shadows as she darted ahead. Peter's laughter echoed through the air, sharp and mocking. "Run, little traitors!" Peter's voice called. "You can't escape me!" James pushed himself forward, every step sending a jolt of pain through his arm. The cliffs were so close now, the jagged rocks looming just ahead. He could hear the others behind him, their breaths ragged, their footsteps frantic. And then Peter appeared, stepping out from the shadows with a predatory grin. His dagger gleamed in his hand, and his green eyes glinted with malice. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice light and teasing. James skidded to a stop, his wooden sword raised. The others stumbled to a halt behind him, their faces pale with fear. "Stay back," James said, his voice steady, despite the fear tightening in his chest. "We're leaving, Peter." Peter tilted his head, his grin widening. "You think you can leave Neverland? You think you can leave me?" James tightened his grip on the sword. "We're not afraid of you." Peter laughed, the sound bright and cruel. "You should be." Tiger Lily stepped forward, her blade gleaming in the sunlight. "Keep going," she said to James, her voice firm. "We'll hold him off." "No," James said, his jaw tightening. "We fight together." Tiger Lily hesitated, but there was no time to argue. Peter lunged, his dagger flashing toward James. Tiger Lily blocked the strike with her blade, the sound of metal on metal ringing through the air. The clearing erupted into chaos. Tiger Lily's warriors clashed with Peter, their movements swift and precise. Tinker Bell darted through the fray, her light disorienting the fighters as she buzzed around them. James focused on the cliffs, his heart pounding. The portal had to be there. It had to be. He turned to Nibs and the other boys. "Go! Get to the cliffs!" "What about you?" Nibs asked, his voice shaking. "I'll be right behind you," James said. "Just go." The boys hesitated, but a sharp glare from James sent them running toward the cliffs. James turned back to the fight, his sword clutched tightly in his remaining hand. He couldn't leave. Not yet. The fight was brutal, but Tiger Lily's warriors held their ground. Peter's movements were fast and precise, but even he couldn't match the combined skill of the tribe. For the first time, James saw a flicker of something in Peter's eyes. Doubt. "James!" Nibs's voice called from the cliffs. "The portal! It's here!" James turned, his heart leaping. He started toward the cliffs, his legs burning with effort. Peter shouted behind him, his voice filled with rage. "You can't leave, James! Neverland is mine!" James didn't look back. He reached the cliffs, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and saw the portal. A shimmering doorway of light, its edges rippling like water. "Go!" James shouted to the others. "Get through!" One by one, the boys stepped into the light, their forms disappearing as the portal swallowed them. James turned back, his eyes meeting Tiger Lily's. She nodded once, her expression resolute. "Go, James," she said. "I'll hold him." James hesitated, his chest tightening. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible. Tiger Lily gave him a small, fierce smile. "Don't forget us." James stepped into the portal, the light engulfing him. As the world around him faded, Peter's furious scream echoed in his ears, a chilling promise of what was to come. The light of the portal engulfed James, a swirling kaleidoscope of colors that blurred the edges of his vision. It felt as though he were being pulled in every direction at once, his body weightless and stretched thin. He closed his eyes against the overwhelming sensation, his thoughts a chaotic tangle of fear and relief. And then, with a jarring finality, it was over. James stumbled forward, his knees hitting solid ground. The cold, damp smell of earth filled his nostrils. He opened his eyes slowly, blinking against the dim light. Around him, the other boys were sprawled across the forest floor, their faces pale and wide-eyed. Nibs was the first to sit up, his gaze darting around. Where are we?" Nibs asked, his voice trembling. James pushed himself to his feet, his legs unsteady. The forest was unfamiliar, the trees taller and darker than those in Neverland. The air was heavier, cooler, and the distant hum of life was subdued, lacking the vibrant magic of the world they had left behind. "We're home," James said, his voice hoarse. "We're back in the real world."